So welcome to Lovinglagos and welcome to Onikan House. It's just past after 5 here, and we have a couple of guests in the audience here. Hi, virtually. Okay, so it wasn't just me clapping. Okay, do it again. And we have people online. Please, you can clap too. So, welcome to Lagos, Barnaby. We are here to talk about your book, and for those of us at home who don't know it, Loot, and as you can see, mine is well thumbed. Before we begin, I'd like to actually compliment you on a book that is one, fascinating, thrilling, and a book that I imagine must have been, apart from being difficult to write, because the amount of research that is evident in the book. What strikes me in the book is how you are so fair. Okay, so there were parts where I was reading it and I was like, oh my God, how can he say that about the Nigerian Museum, the litter, the rubbish? But then at the same time, you are scathing about things in the British Museum. Their policy stands, their not ability to move as quick as they should. How long did it take you to write, first of all?
Well, thank you very much, Aduke. I mean, maybe the genesis of the book came from the time when I lived in Nigeria, which was in for a 3-year period from around the millennium, 98 to 2001, which is the first time I visited Benin City, the first time I visited the Lagos National Museum, the first time I really learned a lot about the history of the Benin bronzes. So I think the idea was dormant within my mind for a long time. I should be clear about what I think the book is and what it is not. I went into the project very conscious of my limitations. I'm not an anthropologist, nor am I an Edo-linguist. I am in no way qualified to write if you like, a social, a spiritual, a cultural history of the Benin bronzes or Edo culture. What I felt I did have some qualification to write was, if you like, a political history of the Benin bronzes, and specifically my own country, Britain's involvement, you might say very tragically, very egregiously, in the history of the bronzes. Now that required something of the backstory prior to the dramatic events of 1897, which is obviously a turning point, quite a lot about the events of 1897, and then everything that has happened since. And of course, I sensed as I was finishing the book that this great debate was bubbling up. It was getting very, very topical, maybe especially here in the West. Of course, you might say that the pain never went away, obviously, for the Edo people, but suddenly this debate was boiling up, manifesting itself in various ways in the West. So I felt it was an opportune time to write a book that people would want to read. I set out in some ways with the old-fashioned values of BBC World Service journalism, which was, I did try to be fair to a wide range of opinions. And it is not a polemical book. And I don't expect everybody to agree with everything I've said. Guess what? I didn't agree with a lot of the people I spoke to in this book. But I felt that I should present their range of opinions as openly as possible and allow readers to come to their own conclusions.
Okay, thank you for that introduction to the book. And maybe I have assumed that people know who you are, so let's introduce you. So everybody online and everybody here, Barnaby Phillips is a journalist, a very experienced journalist. He was born in Kenya and lived for many years in Kenya. He has spent a lot of his career in Africa, as he just said, 3 years in Nigeria, but also Malawi, South Africa, and Botswana, I believe.
Yes, actually, I was born in London. I was brought up in Kenya. But that's right. Okay, so I was with the BBC for 15 years, and most of that was physically in Africa. 3 unforgettable years in Nigeria, a year and a half in Mozambique, a year in Angola, and 5 years based in Johannesburg. But I had the good fortune to travel over much of the continent during that time. And after the BBC, I joined Al Jazeera, where I stayed another, 13 years. And that took me to Greece, which was a very different experience, and reported a lot from the Balkans, the Middle East. Also became quite familiar with the Parthenon marbles, which are almost kind of the counterpoint to the Benin bronzes in the debate over cultural restitution, which gives me a fascinating perspective on that. And then I came back to my native London a few years ago, and this is where I am now.
Okay, fantastic. So I believe you have a short presentation for us.
That's right. So I'll whiz through a presentation exactly about the history of the bronzes. Mm-hmm. It's, as I was saying in the introductory chat just before everybody joined us, it's such a privilege to be having this conversation with a predominantly Nigerian audience, or people who know and love Nigeria, because it's very different to talking in English schools or literary festivals in small towns in England or Scotland. So I think there'll be some things that I will say that, is knowledge that is very obvious to all of you, or sorry, hopefully not to all of you, knowledge that is obvious to many of you, but hopefully not all of you. And forgive me, and I'll try and whiz through those parts, if you see what I mean. But I'll see if we can share my screen. Thank you very much, Aduke. So that's here, and then we go into.
Okay. And one thing that before you start, that I must say I love about your book is the absolute cast of thousands. I actually felt as though I should have a little chart and remember who everybody is and who everybody was and what they had done. Okay, off you go.
Okay, off I go. Well, the Benin bronzes from Africa to Britain and back again. And maybe we should start, I suppose, with what is Barnaby even talking about when he's talking about the Benin bronzes? Because people have different definitions. The context in which I will normally be referring to them in our conversation this evening is I'm using the word collectively for thousands of bronze, brass castings, ivory carvings, sculptures from the Kingdom of Benin. And what you're seeing here are 2 of the most iconic, 2 of the most exquisite. Both, many scholars believe, represent Queen Idia, a 15th century queen of Benin. Both are in the British Museum today. Look at the one on the left. As if from ancient Greece, said Ormond Dalton, a curator at the British Museum when he first saw it in 1897. Others compared the finest Benin bronzes to the work of Renaissance Italy. The piece on the right, the ivory carving, of course, in Nigeria, many people think of it as the Festac mask, a mask that has a dual symbol, I would say, not just of pre-colonial African cultural achievement, but also of, I suppose, Britain's enduring inflexibility in that great controversy that came up in the 1970s that many of you will recall. When the British Museum obtained this mask in 1909, some years after 1897, curators there were exultant. They felt that they had the greatest individual piece to have come out of Benin. Now, of course, this was a royal art made by an elite guild working specifically for a king or successive kings, the Obas. And here we see roughly the extent of the Benin kingdom in 1897, that fateful year. Of course, at the height of its power, earlier, going back hundreds of years, it would have extended a great deal further in the west, particularly towards Lagos, perhaps even beyond Lagos. and across to the River Niger a little bit further to the east. Now, what do we know of this kingdom? This is a famous picture by a Dutch writer, Olfert Dapper, from the late 17th century. Now, Dapper didn't travel himself. He stayed in Amsterdam, but he compiled accounts. And there's much that is consistent here with what we can see from other writings from Europeans. Comparisons with Lisbon, Amsterdam, very clear. We see the king, of course, the Oba, on his horse. We get a sense of his military power. We get a sense of a powerful and magnificent walled city behind him. We see the chained leopards at the front, which are symbols of his power. Europeans are fascinated. This is a kingdom with which they interact peacefully for some 400 years. They trade spices, cloths, ivory is of enormous importance, slaves as well. It was, of course, the Portuguese who got there first, and they had an enduring influence. These are Benin plaques, in fact, photographed shortly after they arrived in Europe. This picture is taken in 1899, and they depict the Portuguese very accurately in late medieval armor. They cause confusion in Britain because at the time, Africa is meant to be a place without history, and yet here we see these symbols, these images of Portuguese traders from the 15th century. In fact, some of you might have heard of the great Victorian explorer, Richard Burton. He visits Benin City in the 1860s, and he says that, to quote his language, in the kingdom, around the king, they speak a bastardized version of Lusitanian Portuguese. Now, Burton's visit, I think, comes at a time of hardening attitudes towards Benin. By the 19th century, it is the British who are very much in the ascendancy as the European power on the West African coast. The Portuguese, the Dutch, the French have faded away. The Brits, who were very interested in slaves, are no longer so interested in slaves. They want rubber. Above all, they want palm oil. And with a greater commercial drive comes a greater moral zeal, a greater sense of superiority. Subjects like slavery, human sacrifice become subjects of great fascination and fierce moral condemnation. And already by the mid-19th century, you have big commercial interests, particularly in cities like Liverpool and Glasgow, who are saying the Oba has to go. He is an obstacle to British trade. And they are agitating for an armed takeover. Now, the actual events of 1897 are enormously controversial. I'll sort of gloss over them a little bit. But essentially, you've got a British government that is not quite in tune with its commercial interests and is saying, we're not quite sure about invading. We're not quite sure if it's worth the expense. West Africa is still a white man's grave from the white man's perspective. And is it worth the trouble? Now that changes in January 1897. And some of you might know this grave. It's about 30 miles south of Benin City. And it is a very neglected grave today. It is the 7 Englishmen killed en route to Benin, led by Vice Consul James Phillips. Now, his immediate motives remain controversial, something of a mystery, but the deaths to the British, they make no effort at all to record the deaths, perhaps hundreds of carriers who are with them, but the deaths of the 7 white men caused an enormous political shock in London. And I think at that point, the British, having hesitated, take the plunge and decide that that they have no choice. They are going to invade Benin. From the Oba side, from the Benin Kingdom side, I think there's a lot of confusion at this point. I think the British are feared. They've seen in 1894 how brutally they've treated a nearby king, King Brahimi, the Itsekiri king. They feel an invasion is inevitable, but there are also divisions within the kingdom. The decision is made by the British, a punitive expedition, so-called, will be sent. And here you can see senior figures on the Batter steamer at Liverpool about to take off. Ralph Moore, the seated man, something of a shadowy figure, the senior colonial officer at the time, the man who ended up stealing the ivory mask, the Festat mask. But the man who's given overall charge of the mission is Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, very popular in the British Navy. Those of you who know St. Paul's Cathedral, you can find a tablet today to Admiral Sir Harry Rawson, only yards away from Admiral Lord Nelson himself. Now, the military outcome of the punitive expedition, I would say, was never in doubt, because Admiral Rawson has a fearsome new weapon, the Maxim gun. It fires 10 bullets a second. They have rockets. And even though the Edo resistance is fierce, the British prevail. They take Benin City. And from the British point of view, from the white man's point of view, and forgive me if I'm talking a little bit too much from the white man's point of view at the moment, that will change during this talk. I think this would be, forgive me for putting it so brutally, another little forgotten imperial war, what Rudyard Kipling called the Savage War of Peace, if not for this, what we're talking about tonight. The British, quotes, discover the Benin bronzes in the Oba's palace. One of them writes in their diary, a regular harvest of loot. For the British, this is loot. These are curios. For the Edo themselves, of course, these pieces record history. They're religious. It's as if the British are looting a national library and a cathedral all at once. And everything is just taken willy-nilly. Altars dating back hundreds of years are carelessly disassembled. The king's house is rather a marvel, writes the London Graphic, with a picture depicting the British troops in the Oba's palace. The looting goes on for several days. Here you can see loot being loaded onto the donkey of a man called Seppings Wright, who was a famous war correspondent of the 1890s. And I think he's an important figure in this story. He comes back with some very lurid stories about Benin City. Benin City as the city of blood. I think that helps fix its image in the British popular imagination, and the consequences of that play out over subsequent decades. And of course, here is Oba of Aranwe, the deposed Oba, on a colonial ship called the Ivy, being taken into exile to Calabar. He will never see his kingdom again. Note the chains around his ankles. There are a series of photos of Oba of Aranwe on the Ivy during that journey. He's paraded around the Niger Delta. It's as if he has become a trophy as well for the British. They're keen to show him in Brass, Nembe, the other places where they've recently put down uprisings to show the Itsekiri, the Ijo, the Yoruba their power, that they can topple an Edo king. Interestingly, I think on later pictures on that boat, he looks more philosophical, less furious than he does in this picture. Of course, not all the Edo accept the British takeover. Some of them fight with extraordinary determination. This is Olobosere, who's not captured until 1899. He fights an incredible guerrilla war for a further 2 years. The British call him treacherous and barbaric. Perhaps today we might describe him as a freedom fighter. This picture is taken after his capture, moments before his execution. But to the victor, the spoils. This is a British officer who took part in the expedition. He's called Lieutenant Norman Burrows. He's posing back home in Derbyshire with some of his Benin loot. I'm just using him as an example. Like many of the officers, of course, he's not an art critic. He's interested in tusks. Tusks are often what the British officers wanted the most. They are the best curios. In fact, he writes Benin curios. That's his handwriting. This is taken from his own photographic album at the bottom. And Norman Burroughs takes part in this event, which is at the Royal Military Tournament in 1898 in London, in Islington, just a few streets away from where I'm speaking to you right now, my friends. And this is a reenactment of the taking of Benin City with all the, quotes, grisly rituals involved. These are British officers in blackface. And the whole event has an air of authenticity because Norman Burroughs takes part. They use other weapons, which they took during the takeover of Benin City. And this is a great success. The British royal family come, it plays to packed houses. The King of Siam or Thailand is coming and it gets rave reviews. Now, even while this reenactment is going on at the Royal Military Tournament, Norman Burroughs, like a lot of the British officers, is looking to make a quick buck from his participation. And he sells off his Benin curios to a man called Augustus Pitt Rivers, who you might know from the museum in Oxford today. He is a great Victorian collector. He sells off his collection for the equivalent of about £20,000 today in British money, 30,000 US dollars if you like. In other words, a tidy sum, don't get me wrong, the amount of money that would make all of us happy, but it doesn't actually transform his life. It is several decades later that Benin bronzes really start attaining crazy prices, I would say, on the Western art market. But Norman Burroughs is an example of how the Benin bronzes are dispersed. This man is crucial in that process. His name is William Webster. He is the son of a Greenwich potato dealer. And there are auctions in London between 1897 and 1901 in particular, during which the Benin officers, those who took part in the expedition, sell off their loot. And William Webster reacts with great alacrity. He's a very canny businessman. He's in touch with museum curators in Germany in particular, also in Holland, also in Scotland. And he's always cutting deals. If you go through his letters, he's offering you this amount, but don't tell, I'll sell you this to Dresden. Don't tell Leiden, I'll give you 20% off here. Oh, no, you need to, we're running out. You need to pay quick. He makes a lot of money out of the Benin bronzes very quickly. And he's a crucial cog in the wheel that has ensured that Benin bronzes today are spread around many of the great museums of the West, not of the world, of the West, really, North America later, and Europe. But the biggest single collection goes to the British Museum itself here in London. Some 300 plaques are put on display in September 1897, a matter of months after the British have taken Benin. And the responses to this exhibition in the British press are fascinating. Words like remarkable, baffled, amazed crop up in all the press coverage. There is a contradiction between how Benin has been portrayed, this primitive city, this city of savagery, and this highly sophisticated art. And people cannot marry these contradictions. And so all sorts of theories come out. Oh, it was actually the Portuguese who did it themselves. Or maybe the Portuguese taught the Edo how to cast metal in this very sophisticated way. Or maybe even more fantastical theories. It was the ancient Egyptians or some wandering Indian tribe. The debate goes on for a long time. Something else is happening with this appreciation. The meaning of the Benin bronzes is changing. They have been ripped out of the Edo's hands. That original spiritual purpose has been taken away. And if you like, under a cold European gaze, they are becoming objects of art. They are being appreciated aesthetically in a different way. In fact, the Foreign Office ends up giving these plaques to the British Museum, which goes on to gradually acquire more and more. The British Museum is acquiring Benin bronzes until 1986. Today, it has almost 1,000, the largest collection of 1897 loot in the world. Typically, it displays about 100. And this is the plaque display downstairs in the Sainsbury Gallery, for those of you who know the British Museum. Now, one of the things I try and do in Loot, my book as well, is not just talk about museums, but follow the private market, because there are hundreds of exquisite Benin bronzes in the private market. This is a particularly splendid and beautiful piece By the 1970s, the meaning of the Benin bronzes is changing again. I've spoken about the transformation from spiritual to art. They are also becoming high-level investments for the reclusive and the wealthy. And this piece is a classic example of that. It was bought by an art dealer for auction in London in the 1950s. It spent 63 years hidden in a London bank vault. It was sold for a secret price of £10 million in 2016, as I uncover in my book. And my conversation with the woman who sold it, the daughter of Jewish exiles who fled from Nazi Germany, I felt was an extraordinary conversation. Meanwhile, what about the Edo themselves, the people whose culture was stolen? Well, of course, the Oba and his people have never abandoned the idea that their treasures be returned, but for a long time, nobody listened. The man clutching Queen Idia in the British Museum is Usman Lawal Osula, a leading Edo chief. He's visiting, I think it was 1965. He almost seems to be saying, please, can we have it back? And you can see William Fagg, the great British Museum curator, a man who knew Nigeria very well, the rather short gnomic man who's basically saying, no chance, I'm afraid, he seems to be saying. This argument ebbs and flows over the decades. It peaks in the 1970s at a time when Nigeria, of course, is on something of a high after the Civil War, flush with oil cash. It hosts Festac, and the Queen Idia Mask becomes a big diplomatic issue. And I go through that in detail. I've had access to unclassified British government papers and British museum papers, which is absolutely fascinating. It rises again in the 1990s. Some of you might know the late British MP, Bernie Grant, one of the first Black members of Parliament, and he makes the Benin bronzes a bit of a cause in the late 90s. But essentially, he is a voice in the wilderness, and no one really is listening. One complicating factor in this story is that Nigerian museums do build up a superb collection of Benin bronzes in the meantime. And a lot of that is to do with a man on the right, who's called Kenneth Murray, who some of you may know about. A British art dealer, or artist rather, who goes out to Nigeria in the 1920s. And essentially, I think it's fair to say, is a man full of contradictions, but he ends up giving his life to Nigeria. Quite literally, he dies in a tragic car accident there in 1973. Through the 50s and 60s, Kenneth Murray sets up the Nigerian National Museum system, which still survives, of course, today. And Kenneth Murray is determinedly buying up with as much money as he can scrape and scrimp, both from the British colonial government, from private investors. I've been through his letters. In particular, he's buying up Benin bronzes in the 1950s and taking them back to what will be his new National Museum in Onikan, in Lagos, from where you're hearing me today. Now, maybe in the conversation, we can talk about the decline of Nigerian museums. I would say particularly through the 80s and 90s, a notorious time of thefts. Today, not many people actually go to the National Museum. If you look at the most recent records, literally most of the children there are school children on compulsory visits. And yet the fact of the matter is, and it's an awkward fact and it doesn't get said very much in this debate, Nigerian national museums have probably the fourth largest collection of Benin bronzes in the world, and they have many of the finest Benin bronzes in the world, because Kenneth Murray knew what he was doing when he was buying back. He was very, very selective, very, very discerning, you might say. And yet, despite these problems, the restitution debate has changed quite dramatically in recent years, as you all know. And this brings us up to the present. I think this man on the right, Mark Walker, had something to do with that. He's there with the brother of the late Oba, I think that's Onikan on the left. And Mark Walker had inherited Captain Herbert Walker's Benin bronzes. He was one of those figures you saw on the boat right at the beginning. Mark, who's a retired doctor from Anglesey, Wales, an extraordinary man. He had always coveted these Benin bronzes. In fact, what he didn't know was that Herbert Walker had taken an enormous amount of loot. Much of it was sold off in an auction in London in the 1930s. And Mark ended up with these two little pieces, the bird and the bell. But when they actually became his, he suddenly decided he wasn't very comfortable with them at all. And his own children made it clear to him that they weren't very comfortable either. So Mark had never been to Nigeria, who'd followed some of the debate about restitution, which can go on and on around museums. He thought, I don't need these. And he got on a plane himself and he went to the Oba's palace and he gave them back and he received a hero's reception. I think that was a striking individual act of conscience. And perhaps it hinted at ways in which, if you like, the zeitgeist was changing here in the West. A few other things happened in subsequent years, and in a way, this is all part of the history we're going through now. You'll know that President Macron of France made an extraordinary speech in Ouagadougou in 2017. He said it was no longer acceptable that so much of Africa's cultural heritage was in European museums. He commissioned a report that came out the next year, the Savoie report. I think the report was probably much more radical than he had expected. And gradually, the Benin bronzes themselves become emblematic, I would say, of the debate around colonial art. They are, to quote the German cultural minister, the touchstone of this debate. And so today we have a situation where Cambridge, Aberdeen have given back Benin bronzes, where the Germans say they'll be giving back Benin bronzes by the hundreds starting in 2022. All sorts of museums queuing to give them back. But to who exactly and to what sort of institution? And I think Nigeria has an extraordinary opportunity that has almost fallen into its lap, I would say. I say it is driven by political and cultural changes in the West. This is Inoche Ogbegbo, an artist in Benin City, part of a team who are putting together a proposal for a new museum with the celebrated architect Sir David Ajayi. And they're calling it EMOA, the Edo Museum of West African Art. But perhaps inevitably, I would say, given the interest and perhaps even the hype around Benin bronzes, there are fissures, there are cracks on the Nigerian side, and there are sharp differences in Edo State between the vision of Godwin Obaseki and that of Oba Owerri II. And of course, the federal government as well has a different agenda. And so that will be fascinating to watch as it plays out in the months to come. Now, let's go right back to where we started. I talked about the Benin bronzes as the objects that were stolen in 1897, but I think in some ways that's very insulting and limited because, of course, the artistic tradition never died. It never went away. Egon Street is still there. This is Phil Omodamwen, who's one of the finest brass casters in Lagos, in Benin City today. And in that sense, the Benin bronzes did not end in 1897. The brass casting tradition did not die. Lost wax method is still vibrant. And I think many people who visit Benin City today, actually, the strongest feeling that they might come away with is not what the British destroyed in 1897. It is the strength of the culture that has endured. So that's my very introduction. I know I've ranged over an enormous amount of material, but those are some of the themes that I try and cover in my book. And I hope that was a useful way to start our conversation. I'd be very happy to pick up on anything Aduke or anyone else would like to raise.
Thank you very much. Sorry. Okay. Okay, I think we should give a round of applause for that. Okay. Hi, Barnaby.
Hello. I can hear you, Aduke, yes.
Hello, Barnaby.
Hello, Aduke. Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. Okay. Do you want to stop sharing your screen now?
I'll stop sharing my screen. Yep.
Okay. Okay. I think I think everybody's listening. Just wait for a few minutes while we change the speaker over. Hang on. Okay. How are you doing? Okay. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay. The thing, okay. Can you speak, Barnaby, because we can't hear you here.
You can't hear me. Can anyone hear me?
Yes, we can. Okay, so, okay, super. So I'm going to ask everybody here again to show their appreciation for what I think was a really great summary of a very enthralling book. Thank you so much. I'd actually like to start in the middle. I'd like to take up the discussion that you had with Frida, because I agree with you that that was a fascinating conversation. Frida was the daughter of the Jewish art dealer whose father had escaped from the Nazis and had purchased this head and had given instructions that it was not ever to be sold except there was another Holocaust. And now if we think about all at the end of the 20th century, all the discussions around the reparations back to the Jewish families of art that had been seized by the Nazis, and how there's international legislation, how there are court cases, and yet the similarities between that seizure and the seizure of the Benin bronzes doesn't seem in people's eyes to be so apparent. And I felt that Frida's conversation, as you had reported in your book, showed she understood deep down that the dichotomies weren't so far apart, and yet she was able to overlook that and say, well, you know what, I just want my family to be happy, so I'm going to sell. Was that your feeling as well?
Yes, yeah, I think you've summarized it quite well. This is the Jewish lady who comes across this unexpected inheritance after her father's died. And I think her conscience is troubled. A fascinating bit of context, which I think is relevant, is that she's married to a black man in Britain. He's of Jamaican origin, but he's part of the African diaspora. In fact, her son has written articles about Benin bronzes, not knowing his own family's backstory. I think that parallel, not necessarily a parallel, but that question of, well, if we're changing the laws for Nazi loot, why aren't we doing the same for colonial loot, is one that puts Western institutions in a very uncomfortable spot. And what is the difference? Yes. And I tried to have that conversation with curators at the British Museum. In fact, I feel, without wanting to sort of blow my own trumpet, but I feel I got extraordinary access to the British Museum, which is an incredibly hard place to get your foot in the door. And had some very candid conversations with curators and trustees. That was not a question that curators wanted to address directly. A trustee said, oh, well, it's different, you know, you've got to draw the line somewhere. Maybe that line is 1900.
But this is
well, 1897 is quite close to 1900.
quite.
Maybe that line, and this is where it's less comfortable for the British Museum. Obviously, it's not something they would want to say. Maybe that line subconsciously in the European psyche is a racial or a geographical one. We're prepared to change laws for atrocities and crimes committed here in Europe in the 20th century, but we're not prepared to extend that generosity to our own former colonies. We're not prepared to extend that generosity to Africa. Maybe that's it. But you're right. I think this woman, Frida, is troubled in her own conscience at what she did. I'm not going to answer this question, but I'm going to pose it to everyone on this call. You are offered £10 million, completely legally. There's nothing illegal about this sale at all. Do you turn your back on what that offers your family, the opportunities? She didn't turn her back on it.
Yeah.
I'm not going to condemn somebody who does not turn their back on £10 million legally. I think there are serious moral and ethical problems, and I think she's aware of them. But she's not a criminal in the eyes of the law.
No, and she's not. But it's actually a very difficult moral situation. And I think back to your earlier comment about the British not willing to give the same leeway to colonial issues as they are to the Nazis. I'd like to quote back to you your quotes in your book where you quote Wellington, when Napoleon had seized so much work and so much artwork, and Wellington comments that the French would like to keep the work of art, not because Paris is the proper place, but because they are trophies of a conquest. And do you think that's a quote that could subconsciously be applied back? And do you think that is perhaps the thrust of the differences in moral feelings that are coming out in the West? The Black Lives Matter, in summer last year, the fact that there's more people able and willing to talk about these difficult things. The fact that, for instance, during the transatlantic slavery, Britain was unique in that, slavery doesn't happen here. It happens out in the colonies. But when, like Lord Mansfield said, when a slave comes to England, they are free. But slavery is something that happens outside. But it's only in recent years that work is being done to show that all those big, wonderful, beautiful houses are founded on slavery and the profits from slavery. And do you think that the Benin bronzes are somehow an epitome of this? And I think the word loot is so good because it's a word that shows there wasn't a sense of respect for the artwork. It was just loot. It could have been, it's just, look, I'm here, I'm as a soldier, I might not be paid, let me just get what I can. And yet, when those works were taken back to the West and were displayed to the West, the shock, the bafflement that you've referred to, that bafflement has allowed a whole industry to grow up around the Benin bronzes, the curators, the art history experts, and yet that skill is not allowed to be shown to the owners. The respect of the spiritual and the historical aspect is not given. It is just, these are such beautiful works of art. What do you think?
I essentially agree with you, Aduke. I think although those contradictions, if you like, are catching up with the West. I think in Britain in particular, it's to do with the fact that we've become a much more multi-racial society than we were just a few decades ago. I mean, the streets of London look very, very different to the streets of London that I was born in the late 60s, early 70s. It's a different place. And if you like, the empire has come back to us. And if in America, Black Lives Matter manifested itself around police brutality and the legacy of slavery in that country, in Europe, it is one of the ways it's manifested itself is in a very anguished debate about the legacy of empire. And the Benin bronzes in some ways are a relatively cut and dry issue, because the manner in which they were taken is really quite shocking, quite egregious, very well recorded, even photographed, as you've seen, and really not that long ago, right at the end of what is called the scramble for Africa. So it's in some ways, it's a relatively clear case. Now, I guess my concern about this, and I hinted at this at the end of my talk, is that this is a very Western debate. This whole restitution debate has been driven by social and cultural and political changes here in the West, which is not to say that people such as the Edo did not care about it. Of course they cared about it. It's their culture, but they are used to being ignored for so long. And suddenly they're actually quite powerful in this debate, but it's almost fallen into their laps. And the shock of trying to adjust to this new position in the relationship is a very challenging one. And that's why I would say that on an issue like this, it is politics in Nigeria, or politics in the Democratic Republic of Congo, politics in the Benin Republic, in Senegal, which have to shape the future of restitution. It can't be shaped here in the West if it is to mean anything.
I think you're right. And just before I address that point, I want to react to something you said about how it came at the end of empire. But I want to look at it from the other way. When you made the point that in your book, the obituaries of the people, of the soldiers who were dying or who had taken part in the campaign, they were dying in the 1960s and the 1970s. It's not that long ago in human history, so it's not, so even in the West or in here in Nigeria, it's something that it is our grandfathers and it's our great grandfathers. It's people that people could have met, could have known. And I think that is what is actually so shocking about it, that these things were taken. And there was an article I read just recently that there were even issues of rape that happened as well. It wasn't just the killings, the use of the Maxim gun, the explosives. It was actually a horrific assault. And I think that one of the things in your book that struck me was actually the circularity of so many things. That when one of the justifications was the human sacrifice was so awful, there was so much of it. But the point was that it was the fear of the British conquest, of the British soldiers coming, that was allowing perhaps the sacrifices to be made to propitiate. So had there not been that attack, perhaps there would not have been so many sacrifices. And one of the pheasants that was given to the Queen by
Goan.
Yes, exactly. Had been bought back by Kenneth Murray from the British Museum, and then was given back to the Queen. There are so many examples of circularity around the Benin bronzes. It's how, how how did you sit and not be overwhelmed just by the amount of the material and the coincidences that would just came up? Oh my God, this is the son of this man. This is the daughter of that person.
I mean, I have to say, I loved uncovering all these tales, you know, following. I mean, I loved going through old auction bills in the 1930s, obituaries, trying to tie this moment to that person. It was so exciting. In fact, it's become addictive. And since the book came out in hardback, it's in some ways it's frustrating because I've uncovered new mysteries and even incredible new letters from members of the expedition and incredible stories about bronzes being sold here or there. That fortunately, when it comes out in paperback, I'm being allowed to write a new chapter with some of this new stuff. But
so we have to buy a new book.
But I think as well, Aduke, what I also wanted to introduce some nuance into this debate, because I think I think it can become very polemical and very, you know, black and white, and people are, you know, this person was villainous and that person wasn't. And I don't think people are quite like that. I think people are more complex than that. And so there are fascinating contradictions. So people on this call, you would have seen Jesus College, Cambridge giving back its cockerel last 2 weeks ago. Now that cockerel was taken by a man called George William Neville, very lazily described in the British newspapers as Captain Neville. He wasn't a soldier. He was a banker who lived in Lagos for 30 years. And he was Captain Neville, George Neville. He was a consistent thorn in the side of the colonial authorities because of his belief in racial equality. And he was a great friend of King Nana of Brahimi, the Itsekiri king. In fact, when Nana fled the British, he came to Lagos and sought refuge in George Neville's house. And when Nana was eventually put back, he had to go to the Gold Coast in exile. When he returned 10 years later, he celebrated a Neville Day, which was the day of his return. So even this arch looter, because George Neville took an enormous amount from Benin City, he went on a kind of freelance role there. He wasn't even part of the military. He just went to pillage as much as he could. He was a racial progressive. Or you have a man like James Holy Johnson, one of the famous early Nigerian Christians who brings Christianity to the Edo. If you look at the contradictions in this man's life from the modern perspective, it's fascinating. He's Yoruba. His parents are enslaved by the Edo. The Edo sell his parents to, I think, Portuguese. The Portuguese are shipping his parents off. They are intercepted off Freetown by the Royal Navy, dumped in Sierra Leone. And so James Johnson grows up with this idea that he will bring Christianity to the Edo, to the people who've treated his parents so terribly. And when he returns to Benin City after it has been captured by the British. And he is both a fierce opponent of colonialism, but he's also convinced that the Edo are, you know, a benighted people who need to see the light and who need to put their past customs behind them. So individuals are full of contradictions, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say. We shouldn't just see the past in simple terms.
Yes.
Or that fit our current narratives.
Yes, I mean, it's like the story of, again, in your book, the friendship between the Oba and Swainson, because Swainson had gone with Galway to persuade him to sign the 1892
treaty, yeah.
Treaty. Yeah. And they were such good friends that the Oba gave him a wedding present. And when the Oba was captured in 1897 and had asked about his friend, Swainson, and was told that he died, the Oba, despite his own, obviously, I've been arrested and captured, was overcome with grief that his friend had died. And I thought that was a really touching story, but even more touching was the fact that the wedding present was put on the porch in
Liverpool.
in Liverpool, right? Yes. And it was just on the porch for what, over 100 years? And then
an art student spots it in the 1960s and says, hang on a sec, this is something quite unusual.
Yes. So I think your book has all these kind of rabbit holes that you can just go down and they are stories in themselves. So I know that my audience will kill me if I keep on talking. So I'm gonna ask, I'm gonna do the physical people first, and then I'll do the online people. Is that okay? Well, even if it isn't, that's the way I'm gonna do it. So
Fine by me.
So physical people, do we have any questions? Yes, please. Would you like to come up here so that he can see you? Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Hello, hi, my name is Judy Dada.
Can you see him?
Hi, Judy. Lovely to see you.
Yeah, you too. Quick question, incredible book. I read both the printed version and I also listened to the audible version. My question is about the audiobook. I just want to know what input did you have in the casting of the guy who read the book, and why you allowed someone who couldn't speak, because I'm Edo myself, I'm Benin. Yeah. Why you allowed someone who couldn't speak Benin or Edo at all read it?
Oh, wow.
It came across as a mockery of the culture of a white man trying to speak Edo when it was King Kong, and all of that stuff. And I was like, why wasn't due diligence taken that? Of course, there's a lot of, you have met a lot of Edo people yourself. Yeah. There are a lot of Edo people in London. Why couldn't they just take the pain of getting an Edo person to read, to speak the Edo in the book? I thought it was really humiliating for us as Edo people that a white man will just not care at all about our language and just yap on like that. Just a quick question. Did you have any input? I presume, because I'm a writer myself, I presume you didn't, but I just want you to tell them, whoever did it, that we don't like it at all.
Yeah, okay. No, thank you very much. Fair point. And the short answer is I didn't have any input. So what happened was somebody bought the audio rights, which obviously I was pleased that somebody would buy the audio rights. And then I said, oh, will I be the narrator? And it's a company in the United States. And they said, well, you know, we'll only pay you $1,000 and you'll have to fly to America yourself and stay in a hotel. And, you know, essentially it was going to cost me money to read it out. So I said, I can't afford to do that, but will you get somebody who will use the correct pronunciation? And they said, yeah, don't worry. And then they sent me a panic message just when they were recording saying, here's a long list of words we don't know how to pronounce. And I got a friend in Benin City, a great a guy who helped me, a wonderful historian, Godfrey Ekato, and he recorded audio files of all the correct pronunciations and sent them to the United States of the contentious words. So, you know, and if they then, you know, for them to make a mess of it, it's disappointing, and I can only apologize.
Thank you. Lawan?
Hi, Barnaby. It's Lawan.
Hi, Lawan.
Okay, so a few comments and then the question will come. Firstly is reading up on you. I know you've done a lot with elephants, and I think you tried to detail a bit of that as well. And I'm particular about this because coming from Lagos, the emblem of the King of Lagos, and you know the connection with the Benin Kingdom, you find a lot of such, not just in Lagos, but in Nigeria, where there's reference to the elephant. And I know that we have, we've hunted them to extinction, but there's still a few. And it was quite interesting to find out that people there were some in somewhere in Edo and
Yeah.
roaming there, and people hardly see them. There's some in Ogun State too, roaming,
Yeah.
people hardly see them and all of that. What do you think should be our way forward regarding, do you think there's any point trying to revive the population, and why? And I mean, you've had the experience, you know, spiritually, economically, and what you think, the whole idea of writing the book is really the way forward, which is thoughts on that first. Secondly, malaria. We look back now and we just think, yeah, malaria, there's a cure to it. And it was quite interesting to read in your book that people had, the cure came before people identified the cause.
Yeah.
And they had found the cure, the quinine, before they knew that it was mosquitoes that was causing it.
Absolutely.
And I draw parallels with that, with where we are today with the coronavirus. Maybe we already have the cure. I mean, just down the road here, they sell all sorts of agbo, and our people can swear by them. Maybe we would have been billionaires in Nigeria now if we've been able to identify that that's the real cure. But you know, there are parallels to be drawn there, and I think it's all being the set of colonialism, slavery, is really hampered us down not to achieve our full potentials. Because even, and you know how they do it with the, is it the placebos they call them? Even just thinking about it alone, you're already cured. So maybe a bit of that too had come to play. Now, finally, what we do here, and that's why we were interested in this talk, is not just to talk about what had happened, but how to use it to plan the future. There are lots of opportunities now regarding the artifacts coming back. What are the opportunities? Yes, we know they're going to return to Benin. We're happy for it to return to Benin. What should be, and I know that you tried not to put everything in a box and say, well, maybe to go to the palace or it should go to the museum that the governor is putting together. But it's, first and foremost, I think it's something of national pride that everybody has to take something out of. And it's a national pride that does not necessarily mean, no, I want the bronzes to come to my state or to my, no, it's not about that. It's sharing the same, you know, excitement, regardless of where it goes, for as long as you're in Nigeria. And I think, firstly, it's an opportunity, seeing all that is happening, to celebrate that at least a wrong is being addressed, firstly. And then secondly, what happens to it whereby people can actually benefit from it coming back. There's no point if they give them all back and nobody bothers to come to Nigeria to come and look at them. There's no point in it back when, you know, it's all about, well, we have the photography rights and you can do virtual tours from the US or the UK or wherever, and all of that. So and I think that would also help to address the issue of restitution. When you genuinely want to help people grow after all the atrocities that have been committed. So I'd really like to learn from you, in your opinion, what we find so exciting about your book is that you were quite critical about both ends of it, both from the British angle and even the Nigerian as well. So we know you have a balanced mindset regarding this. And what would be the way forward? What opportunities should we key into here? I mean, for us here, we're already talking about moving those artifacts around when they come. I mean, obviously with the blessing of the custodians ultimately. But then let every Nigerian, every West African, every African tap into it, because it's about pride. And I always say this, that there's no, whatever happened to us in Africa happened to us. We had no control over it. But it is our job to say, yes, we're here today, and we're in every facet of life all around the world, you know, and that's enough to celebrate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to add to Elawan's point about pride, the first time I saw Benin bronzes was during First Act 77, when Eko Eyo, when he was now the director of the Lagos Museum after Kenneth Murray, he put up 1,000 years of Nigerian art. And it was, till now, it made such a huge impact on me as a child, that was when I developed my love and my understanding that we are a people that did so much, achieved so much. And again, in your book, it was sad for me because I've actually been privileged to see the stores of the Lagos Museum. And they really do have such beautiful objects in the museum, and they are not on display. So even if they do come back, if again they are just kept in boxes in a store, is it any different if they are here? I mean, it would be a different spiritually, but in the terms of boosting national pride, of letting children see the tangible proof of who we were and who we can be, is that an ideal situation? Over to you, Barnaby.
Okay, thank you. So elephants very quickly. Yes, that's right. I work in elephant conservation now after journalism. I'm very passionate. Nigeria still has maybe 400, maybe 500 elephants. What I wanted to show in the book was the cumulative weight of European demand for ivory over hundreds of years. A single Dutch ship sailing down the Benin River in the 17th century had far more ivory on it than there is ivory on living elephants in all of Nigeria today. But it's not too late. There are something like 60, 70 elephants just there in Omo Forest on the doorstep of Lagos. A handful of elephants survive in the forest, Okomu Forest outside Edo. So let's preserve them. Malaria, absolutely fascinating. It's incredible. The British, you're absolutely right. They knew how to cure malaria when they invaded Benin City, but they were terrified of it because they didn't know what caused it. And it was only later, I think the following year, that a Scottish doctor in India makes the connection with mosquitoes. Until then, there's all sorts of weird theories about how you have to sleep with a warm cloth around your tummy and all sorts of nonsense. And so fascinating parallels with how we're trying to catch up with coronavirus and the science. Now, the big issues of the future. I mean, these are really weighty issues. You might have seen just this week, friends, from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, returned 2 Benin bronze plaques to Abba Tijani, the head of the National Commission for Museums and Monuments. He returned those, the Met returned those 2, and not the other 150 or so in its collection, because those 2 were stolen from the Nigerian National Museum after independence. And that is the context. How many of you there in Lagos go to see, Aduke, you've had the good fortune to see the storerooms. How many of you go to that museum? How do we avoid the Benin bronzes coming back and being in some dead museum behind in a glass vitrine that has no connection to the culture that made them? These are big questions and they have to be answered in Nigeria. I think it's fair to say that Sir David Ajayi, the celebrated architect who might be, who might build the MOR Museum, he has a very clear vision. He knows it has to connect to the people. Mm-hmm. Can he and the Oba work together? These are big questions that haven't been resolved. But yes, I'm very sympathetic to that idea that, this is an incredible opportunity to connect with a lost pride. Look at Benin City, Edo State. I'm sorry to speak so frankly, my friends, it is the center of sex trafficking to Europe. That is how desperate poverty and organized crime is. You go, and I'm afraid I've done this. I've worked on rescue boats in the Mediterranean, in southern Italy. Every single girl who you meet comes from Edo State and occasionally from Delta State. This is a people, it's tragic. And so how can you reconnect people and make people feel a sense of pride and achievement? It's not being done through the existing NCMM museums. There is an NCMM museum in Benin City today, by the way. Mm-hmm. So how do we make it work this time? One other point, of course, you're right. That this goes beyond the Edo, and it can be an opportunity for Nigeria for national regeneration. But another point, you can't put the genie back in the box. The Benin bronzes are also part of global heritage. Many of them, those made in the 19th century, have been in European or American museums longer than they were in Benin City. this is part of their history. It's part of global culture. And I think, in fairness to Oba Owerri II and his predecessors, they are very aware of this. Of course, there's a lot of politics in the foreground. In the background, there is a recognition that they are wonderful ambassadors of African culture as well, of Nigerian culture, of Edo culture. And it is good if some of them are in the great cities of the world, in New York, Beijing in the future, London, where people can learn and their minds are expanded by learning. And that's important. It's also fascinating, I think, in many ways, this is a generational thing, how our perspectives have changed. I spent a lot of time in the book talking to a wonderful older academic in Benin City who sadly passed away just this year, Ekagusa Essien, who's a well-known academic of Edo. He was a great doctor, but also an Edo historian. And his perspective, when he walked into the British Museum in the 1950s and saw his people's culture on display there in the British Museum, was one of incredible pride. He thought, my God, this is how important we are. So there will be many Edo people who go to the British Museum today, and they will see the Benin bronzes there. And to quote Victor A. Canimore, the artist will feel that they're seeing their relatives behind bars, that this is degrading, humiliating. There are others who feel that this is a global recognition. So there are different perspectives there, and it's important to remember that. Maybe it's more a generational divide, however.
For myself, I remember the first time I saw the Festac mask in the British Museum. Honestly, I was moved to tears. I mean, I'd seen it, obviously, as a child during Festac, but to actually see it behind the glass door, I think it moves you. It moves you in ways that I think that I'm not from Edo, I'm just a Nigerian in this. And so I can't even begin to imagine how the Edo people themselves, with the spiritual and the historical connections to it, feel. As a Nigerian, I feel that pride, I feel that loss. And so I think there is so much work to be done. Okay?
It's just a comment.
You want to come?
Barnaby is fine. Well, let's say it's Barnaby.
Okay, because and also he might not be able to hear you.
Okay. Okay. Hi, Barnaby. It's Olato. Hello there.
Hi, Olato. Hi, how are you?
Very well, thanks. Yes, you were saying about how they're very good ambassadors, and that's one important perspective. Also, they're very important witnesses to the history that Sorghum brought there. And I think that's very, very important, that our history is Europe's history as well, and I think from that perspective, that these heirlooms, these objets de cultural heritage are witnesses to history, and we need them to an extent at the scene of the crime, if you like. That sounds so a bit crude. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
That the fact that they're in the hands of the former colonizers in their big museums is
in the basement, by the way.
Well, yeah, where they're in the it's testifying to something horrific that took place and that brought. I'm being completely garbled. I'm going to stop talking now because you understand what I'm saying.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tom.
Bye, Barnaby. Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you, Olato. Thank you very much for coming.
Do you have any more questions? Physically, comments? No. Okay. I'm going to go to online. Okay. So, yes, the Smithsonian. There's a question. The Smithsonian Museum of African Art also has a lovely collection. Yes, the answer to that, I think, is yes. Also, the Met also has in fact, the Met has a sister copy of the Festac head as well. And there's a museum in Germany, I believe, that has the other head as well.
So these sacred Festac masks, the ivory carving, there are actually 5 of them, and the story is Ralph Moore, who was the senior colonial officer you saw. He's thought to have stolen all 5 from Oba of Aranwe's bedchamber when the palace was being looted. Ralph Moore came back to London, committed suicide, drank wasp poison, died in 1907, 1908. Two of the 2 most beautiful masks, if I can use that sort of objective aesthetic term, the best one, I think many people would say, is in the British Museum. There is a magnificent one in the Met Museum. There is a 3rd one in the Seattle Museum on the west coast of the United States. There is one in Stuttgart in Germany. That's the 4th one. And then there is a 5th one, which we think is still in private hands, which Henry Galway, who was, as you said, the man who convinced the Oba to sign, coerced, tricked, the previous treaty in 1892, which, if you like, gave the British the pretext for the invasion of 1897, his family tried to sell their masks privately in 2010, and that picked up a controversy, and that mask then disappeared back into the shadow. So that is the mysterious 5th mask.
Okay. Somebody just asking what was the question. The question that you have answered was the Smithsonian.
Yes, the Smith. Yes, so I'll just, very, very interesting about the Smithsonian. Absolutely right. So Benin bronzes, if I could generalize, tended to move. The great American museums start to acquire them from the mid 20th century, if you like. And the largest collections are in the Met, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Chicago Field, I think is it the Pennsylvania or Philadelphia Museum, and there is a significant collection in the Smithsonian in DC, and there is a very, I think I can call her a radical new curator who has just taken over in the Smithsonian, director. She's called Neri Blankenberg, and I happen to know her from a previous life. We were sort of friends of friends living in Johannesburg. She was in Lagos last week. She's only just taken over, and within days of arriving in Washington, she took the Benin bronzes down from display, or those that are explicitly linked to 1897. She put up a sign saying that she didn't want them on display. And I've had some fascinating conversations with her. And basically I'm paraphrasing her, but I'm completely committed to giving these back. I want them to go back as soon as possible. It has to go through the Smithsonian process, which is a complex political process, because ultimately I believe these objects belong to the federal government of the United States. So some things are beyond her power, but that is the direction she's moving in. And I would say that she is typical of a new, younger generation of curators who see the past and their own great institutions' role today in very different ways to their predecessors. And there's a similar debates going on around the British Museum. Maybe we can talk about that, but yeah.
Okay, so another question is online is, we are moving away slightly from the Benin bronzes here, but what are your thoughts on the Oshogbo Grove and the work of Susan Wenger, if you're familiar with that, and how can one preserve and publicize those? And I guess in a way, those preservation and publicity work could be applied to the Benin bronzes as well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm familiar, and Susan Wenger was still alive when I lived in Nigeria. I mean, I guess, I mean, the principle is the same one, that it's not, it has to be driven from within Nigeria, whether it's within.
I agree.
I mean, that it's not going to work otherwise. This can't be. This is not something that well-meaning expatriates in Lagos ultimately can make happen with the Oshogbo grave, and well-meaning curators or historians aren't going to define the success of the return of the Benin bronzes. That has to be in the hands of the Edo. So that is, I would claim no expertise, but that is clearly the parallel. If these restitutions are to be successful, because we're putting so much weight on the objects of these on the shoulders of these little objects. You know, what are we saying? What are we saying, that some statues and masks go back and everything is going to be fine in Nigeria, a country of such complexities and such challenges? Let's be realistic. Let's keep our expectations realistic.
Okay, and actually, and this leads to the next comment, actually, as if you actually seen along with it. And this speaker says, her concern is how we as a government and a people will make these pieces generate revenue and also instill the consciousness of our culture and tradition in us. And yes, you're right, it's something that we have to do, isn't it? Really and truly, because if not, I mean, what's the point, really?
Yes. So if you talk to the people behind EMOA, the Edo Museum of West African Art, and I know, you know, this is definitely not the Oba's preferred route, but I think that the people behind EMOA are conscious that, you know, it's one thing to build an amazing museum, but how is it going to pay its way? It has to be very grounded in the community. It can't be some Western model of a museum that quickly withers and dies. As if you're being unkind, you might say that many of the old style museums in Nigeria have. Let's also be realistic. You know, it's not as if millions of tourists are suddenly going to start coming to Benin City from all over the world. That's not why. That can't be why we're doing this.
No.
Surely we're doing this so that a historical wrong can be corrected and a people can be reconnected with their culture.
Exactly. But really, as you said, I mean, there are so many other things that we have to do to make tourism, especially international tourism, viable and attractive. I mean, and that's a whole different discussion.
Yeah.
I think, okay, another point as well is when we talk about the comment online is when we talk about the Benin bronzes, we should also emphasize that it's not just bronzes, it's also ivory, stools. So perhaps you'd like to speak to that.
Yes, absolutely. I'm using Benin bronzes in quotation marks to refer, if you like, to the collective heritage of the Edo people, and in particular to what was looted in 1897. Because in fact, even the metalworks, the vast majority of them are brass; they're not bronze. So really, I'm using Benin bronzes with a capital B, a capital for Benin and a capital B for bronzes as shorthand. But absolutely, many of the most magnificent works are ivory, the Festite mask, and the other masks, not least. And most of the metalworks are actually brass, not bronze.
Okay. And that brings me back again to this point of the circularity, whereby the quality of the Benin bronzes, the earlier ones, were thought to have improved by the fact that the Portuguese imported so much manila, and they imported the brass, so the Benin casters had access to more material for their work. So again, it's this circularity of and the synchronicity of so much around this work, which you have uncovered in your book, I think is fascinating.
Yes, that's right. So I mean, for those who don't know, so bronze is an alloy of copper and tin, which we think were both available to people in that lower Niger region long before European contact. But once trade starts with the Portuguese in the 15th century, they bring in, as you say, a lot of these brass manillas, big bracelets, which are melted down. Brass is copper and zinc. It's easier to work with. I'm not a chemist or anything, but it's easier to shape and work with at different temperatures. And so that trade with the Portuguese undoubtedly is a catalyst for the production of more Benin bronzes, or should I be saying Benin brasses?
Yes. Okay, so online people, do we have any more questions? Physical people, Any more questions? Yes, yes. Question? Okay. Okay. Okay, I have, okay, so here, there's a comment here. Thank you, Barnaby, for such an engaging evening. It really is a sad reality that most of our museums are dead spaces, but could we not have in place a system where technically the Benin pieces are brought back and so have their base museums here in Nigeria, but are given out to museums on loan for a fee, which may help regenerate our museums. I wonder if this is wishful thinking. What are your views on that? To give them back to us and then we loan them back instead of, and we get a fee for their use.
Yeah, no, thank you, Nikki. Yeah, I don't think that's wishful thinking at all. And actually, I think behind a lot of the political posturing around these issues, and part of the problem of the Benin bronzes is they have become high politics and a big international story. Part of the behind the posturing, people are talking along the lines that you're suggesting. So I think the federal government is actually reasonably pragmatic, and the Oba, as I was saying, are fairly pragmatic. Yes, for them, ownership, recognition of ownership and past injustice is essential. These are theirs, but the idea of them going back on loan is something they're very, very open to. I also happen to know that the German negotiators who will be, trying to strike a deal with the various vested interests in Nigeria soon, they also envisage a situation where there are something like 1,150 Benin bronzes in German museums. I don't think people are expecting 1,150 Benin bronzes to come back to Nigerian museums. Well, they're hoping, they're hoping that title will be transferred, ownership will be transferred, and some sort of deal, I don't want to, don't tie me down to numbers, but some 100 come back and some 100 don't. And I'm sure there are equitable solutions there. One thing I should have said as well, talking about museums that work in Nigeria and how we make it work. Perhaps I should have said this, talking to you there in Onikan. Well, there is an amazing opportunity next year with the John Randall Yoruba Culture and History Center opening just opposite the National Museum, and that could be a symbol of how a new museum can work in Nigeria, in West Africa, that can speak to people and that can be relevant. And its location is so poignant over the road from the National Museum. So maybe this can be a trailblazer. If that can work, that can point the way for Benin City, for the Oshogbo Grove, for all sorts of other places, for Dakar, for Cotonou and other places. So let's see what happens. The expectation is that museum will open in 2022.
Yes, yes. And your mention of Dakar and Cotonou brings us to a new question. Someone is asking, are you able to speak to the position of the French on the matter of African artifacts? And I think, especially after the SAR report.
Yes, I can speak a little. I'm not an expert on the French side. The French, so there are some amazing Benin bronzes in the Musée Quai Branly in Paris, but generally speaking, a lot more of my research was more on the German side. But yes, so in summary, Emmanuel Macron made this radical speech, as I said, back in 2017. And clearly he hoped to chart a different route. He was trying to show that he was not a traditional French president of La Francophonie, that it was a new era. And I think he eyed cultural restitution as somewhere where he could, if you like, win African hearts or minds. With obviously he has his own political agenda, but that doesn't mean to say that his objectives aren't worthy in this regard either. And then he commissioned out this report, which ended up being much more radical, I think, than he expected. Well, he has delivered a little bit, because you would have seen those 26 objects went back to the kingdom of Abomey in the Benin Republic, Old Dahomey, last month, and something is going back to Senegal, and he's talking about something else going to Ivory Coast. Now, nothing like the tens of thousands of objects which should go back according to the SAR Savoir report, but I think he would say he's made a start. you've got to remember the different legal structures within European countries. So if something is in a museum in France, there is a French law of inalienability, which means it cannot be taken out without you need to change the law for each item. And so the French Parliament had to vote a special law for these 26 objects to go back to Abomey. 3 years after Emmanuel Macron promised it would happen, it finally happened. In other words, unless there are legal changes in France, and some people are saying there should be, it will be a cumbersome process. So you might, if you're being cynical, you would say the French have set the ball rolling and raised expectations very high. But others, like the Germans, may well end up moving a lot faster than them, if that helps answer that question.
Okay. And if someone's asking, complimenting you, I had an interesting time and an eye-opener on the history of the bronzes. How can we get your book, please?
Thank you. But Aduke, if you have access to Amazon, you can buy it online through any online retailer. If you're in Lagos, yes, Quintessence in Ikoyi, they ordered some copies. I think they've still got them. Roving Heights, I believe in Surulere area, they have some. And Ouida Books, which is connected to the Ake Festival in Ikeja, they both ordered. So that you're covered in Lagos, Ikeja, Surulere, and Ikoyi. No excuses.
and Roving Heights, they actually have an online order thing as well. So
okay, fantastic.
Yeah. So who was that? So Aduke, yeah. So you can get your copies in time for Christmas. Okay, I think we're running out of time now. Okay, hang on, we have a comment. Yeah, okay. Okay, somebody's definitely getting a copy this week. Clap for them. Are all the rest of you getting your copies this week? Encourage Barnaby, encourage Barnaby. And if you haven't read his first book, okay, I'm gonna give you a plug. Please do. Burma Boy is a fantastic book, and Barnaby doesn't know this yet, but we're going to get him back to talk about that as well.
Another Man's War.
I'm sorry, Another Man's War, yes, but it's a fantastic book, yes. Somebody else is going to get a copy, 2 copies. Gosh, I feel
thank you.
Like an auctioneer here. Okay, so somebody says, back to the discussion on ownership, a binding official contract on ownership and royalty payments between governments could be a possible solution. And yes, I think so. Yes, I
agree. And exactly, I think people just need to be imaginative. The one thing before we go, just very quickly about the British Museum, which gets caught up a lot in these discussions, which is the most important institution. As I said, it has the largest collection of Benin bronzes. The British Museum is in a very difficult situation because it is constrained by British law. There's something called the British Museum Act of 1963, which prohibits it from, it can lend objects, it can't permanently return objects unless the law is changed. Now, the law can change. Of course it can change. The law changed over Nazi loot, as we were saying. Why doesn't it change over this? All I would say is that is a political decision, and it would require this Conservative government here in the UK to take a different line, a different policy on these cultural issues than it has hitherto indicated an interest in. And it's a government that has a comfortable majority in Parliament. So it would be surprising, but not impossible. I also think if we're talking about British politics, for those who know, our Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, I think he's very mercurial, a pragmatic character, you might say. And if the price of global Britain is giving back the Benin bronzes, if that's an image boost in sub-Saharan Africa, it's not impossible, I would say. It's unlikely, but not the history of the bronzes and the histories of restitution has changed so quickly that, perhaps. Let's see what happens. Watch this space.
Okay, so one last round. No more questions while you have him? Nobody? Okay. Barnaby, thank you so very much. Thank you to our audience online. Thank you to our audience physically. I'm going to give you all a round of applause. And thank you so much. And I'm going to ask you, Barnaby, just hold on a couple of seconds so that Lawan and I can have photographs with you. But everybody else, thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for